The single bullet tore through the October air and disappeared into the darkening Idaho sky, swallowed by clouds that had been gathering all afternoon over the peaks of the Sawtooth Range. The sound rolled across the valley like distant thunder, sending every bird within a mile scattering from the pines. And for one long moment, Rowan Pendleton stood absolutely still in the dusty yard of his cabin, with the revolver still pointed at the heavens, a thin ribbon of gun smoke curling upward into the cold mountain air. His hands were trembling. He had not noticed until that moment. He lowered the weapon slowly, the way a man lowers something heavy when he is not certain whether his arms will obey him, and he stared at the place in the sky where the bullet had gone, as if expecting an answer to come falling back down. None came. Of course none came. He had not really believed it would. But the silence afterward was so thick and so heavy that for the first time in years he understood why some men prayed aloud even when no one was listening. He had been talking to the empty sky more often than he cared to admit lately. Talking to it because there was no one else to talk to. Talking to it because the silence on this mountain had become so dense that some nights it pressed down on his chest until he could barely draw breath into his lungs. He was 28 years old. He stood 6'5" in his stockinged feet, broad through the shoulders as a barn door, with eyes the color of dark amber and hands so calloused that they could grip the head of an axe without feeling the wood. He had built this place with his own bare strength. 5 rooms of split pine and river stone rising up from the earth, where there had been nothing but timber and grass when he had first walked this ground at 23 years old, carrying his father's hammer and his mother's Bible, and very little else. There was a barn behind him that could shelter 6 horses through the worst of winter. There were 40 head of cattle grazing somewhere up the steep meadows above the tree line, their bells faintly clanking in the gathering dusk. There were fence lines that stretched for miles across terrain so rough that every single post had to be set by hand, every rail notched and seated with an axe and a maul, and the kind of stubborn back-breaking work that turned young men old before their time. He had done all of it. Every board, every stone, every yard of wire. He had carried 2 younger brothers through grief and into manhood. He had built something real on the slopes of these mountains, and it should have been enough. It was not enough. Rowan Pendleton holstered the revolver and stood listening to the silence that came rushing back in after the gunshot faded. Somewhere up the ridge an elk bugled once low and lonesome, and then the night closed up around the sound, and there was nothing again. Just the wind off the snowfields and the creak of the pines, and the slow, steady beating of his own heart inside the cage of his ribs. A man keeps his word. That was what his father had taught him. But Rowan had never had anyone to make promises to except himself. And lately he had begun to suspect that promises a man made only to himself were the loneliest kind of all. Inside the cabin, a yellow lamplight burned in the kitchen window. Through the glass, he could see the silhouette of Hollis at the table, his middle brother hunched over a rifle he was cleaning by lamplight, the way other men read newspapers. Hollis was 25 years old now, lean and dark-haired with eyes the color of new spring grass, and he had not slept a full night since the winter their parents died. He carved when he was worried. He cleaned weapons when he could not carve. He spoke only when he absolutely had to, and even then he used as few words as a man could possibly use and still be understood. The door opened behind Rowan with a familiar creak. He did not turn around. He knew the footsteps, heavy boots crossing the porch boards in long, easy strides, and then the unmistakable presence of his youngest brother coming up to stand beside him in the yard. Asa was 22. He had their father's amber eyes and their mother's wide, easy smile, and he was the only sunshine in a house full of shadows. "You shot at the sky again," Asa said quietly. Star nearly jumped clean over the fence rail. Rowan said nothing. "You're going to scare the cattle off the upper pasture one of these nights." "The cattle are fine. The cattle are fine. The horses are not fine. Star is a wild Mustang, Rowan. She remembers everything." Rowan turned then and looked at his youngest brother, and in the gathering dusk, Asa's face looked very young and very serious, and for one brief moment Rowan thought of him as he had been at 17, standing in the snow by 2 fresh graves, weeping openly because Asa had never learned how to hide what he felt and never would. "Come inside," Asa said. "Hollis has supper warming. You look like you've been dragged behind a wagon for 10 miles. Rowan came inside. The cabin smelled of pine smoke and venison stew and the strong black coffee that Rowan brewed every evening in a cast-iron pot that had belonged to his mother. Hollis looked up from the kitchen table as the brothers came in, his sharp green eyes reading everything in a single glance, and then he looked back down at his rifle and said nothing at all. On the table beside him sat a small block of pine wood half carved into the shape of a deer emerging from the timber, the antlers still rough and waiting for the blade to find them. Rowan hung the revolver on its peg by the door and sank into the rocking chair beside the stone fireplace. His father had built that chair from mountain ash 30 years ago, the joinery so tight that not one single peg had loosened in all the decades since, and Rowan thought sometimes that the chair would outlast all of them and still be sitting in this room 100 years from now when the Pendleton name was nothing but a memory written on a piece of paper somewhere in a county courthouse. Outside, the last light of October bled out of the sky, and the snow-capped peaks of the Sawtooth Range caught the final amber glow of sunset before the darkness swallowed them whole. The Pendleton Ranch sat at 4,000 feet on the western slope of the Sawtooths, 15 miles of switchback mountain road above the nearest town of Ridgway. 15 miles of creek crossings and granite outcrops, and trails so narrow in places that two horses could not pass abreast. In summer, the ride down took 3 hours. In winter, when the snow piled 6 feet deep and the wind came screaming down off the Continental Divide carrying ice on its teeth, the ranch might as well have been on the moon. The nearest neighbor was 8 miles south. The nearest doctor was Doc Whitman in Ridgway, when he was even there at all, which was not often. It was beautiful country, the kind of beautiful that could stop a man's heart in his chest. Pine forests so thick that the sunlight came down through them in cathedral shafts of green and gold. Creeks running cold and clear over beds of white stone, the water so pure it was straight from the snow melt above. Meadows of blue bunch wheatgrass that rippled like green oceans when the wind moved across them. Elk drifting through the timber at dawn like ghosts. Eagles circling overhead in slow, patient spirals, riding the thermals up and up until they were nothing but specks against the blue. Beautiful country, and lonely enough to drive a man to fire his revolver at the heavens and beg the indifferent stars for an answer. What Rowan did not know, what he would not know for 2 more days, was that an answer was already on its way. It was coming in the shape of a 22-year-old woman from Boston, Massachusetts, who at that very moment was sitting on a stagecoach rattling westward across the high plains of Idaho with $4 to her name, a letter from a stranger tucked inside her bodice, and the desperate hope that the life she was running toward would somehow be better than the life she was running from. Before she would arrive, though, there was a secret, one that had been 6 weeks in the making, and one that was about to change everything. Asa Pendleton had done something none of his brothers knew about. He had written a letter, not to a friend, not to a relative, not to anyone he had ever met in his life. He had written to a newspaper in Boston, Massachusetts, answering an advertisement in the mail-order bride section that he had seen folded inside a copy of the Ridgway Gazette 6 weeks earlier. He had used his own name in the letter. He had described the ranch honestly, the mountains truthfully, the isolation without sugarcoating any of it. But he had written that letter with one very specific purpose in mind. He was not looking for a wife for himself. He was looking for a wife for his oldest brother. Asa knew Rowan. He knew him better perhaps than Rowan knew himself, the way the youngest brother in any family often sees the things the eldest cannot see in his own reflection. Asa knew that Rowan would never write such a letter on his own. Too proud, too stubborn, too accustomed to carrying the whole burden of the family on his own shoulders to ever believe that he himself deserved anything good, anything soft, anything that would not cost him in the asking. But Asa also knew this. The loneliness was eating Rowan alive from the inside out. It was turning him into something harder and more brittle with every passing season, and if something did not change soon, Rowan would become a shell of a man going through the motions of his days without actually being alive inside any of them. So Asa had written the letter. It had been a careful letter, honest, warm in the way that Asa was naturally warm with people, with an easy humor and a directness that made strangers trust him on instinct. He had written that he could not promise an easy life. He had written that the winters in Idaho could kill a person and that a ranch on the mountain was not a tea parlor in Boston. But he had written that he could promise truth and respect and a place where a woman would never have to pretend to be anyone other than who she was. And he had ended the letter with a single line that he had thought about for 2 days before committing it to paper. If that is good enough for you, then you are good enough for us. A woman had written back. Her name was Adelaide Whitmore. Her letter was intelligent and sincere, and it carried a depth of feeling underneath the practical sentences that had surprised Asa when he read it by the lamplight in the barn loft where he kept his correspondence hidden. She wrote about books she loved. She wrote about wanting a life that meant something beyond mere survival. She wrote about needing to start fresh in a place where no one knew her name or her history. She did not sound desperate, Asa had thought when he finished her letter. She sounded determined, and determined was exactly what his oldest brother needed. The problem was this. Adelaide was now on her way to Idaho, and Asa had not told Rowan. He had told Hollis. Late one night 2 weeks ago, while Rowan slept the deep, exhausted sleep of a man who had spent 12 hours mending fence in driving rain, Asa had sat across from his middle brother at the kitchen table and laid out the whole plan from start to finish. Hollis had listened without interrupting, his hands still moving in their slow, steady rhythm as he cleaned the barrel of his rifle. When Asa had finished, Hollis had been quiet for a long time. The kind of silence that, from anyone else, would have been uncomfortable. From Hollis, it was simply the sound of a man thinking. "He will lose his mind," Hollis had said finally. "I know." Another silence, then quieter. "But you are right, he needs this." Hollis had agreed to keep the secret. If Rowan found out beforehand, he would write a cancellation letter so fast the ink would not have time to dry on the page, and that would be the end of it. So they had agreed to wait. And now she was coming. 500 miles to the east, on the rocking bench seat of a Concord stagecoach that creaked and complained over every rut in the road, Adelaide Whitmore sat very still with her small traveling bag clutched on her lap. Her knuckles were white around the handles. Everything she owned in the world was inside that bag. 2 changes of clothes, both practical. A book that had belonged to her mother, the pages worn soft as cloth from years of reading. The letter from Asa Pendleton folded carefully into the cover of the book, and $4 in coins sewn into the lining of her petticoat. $4 between herself and absolute destitution. She was 22 years old. Her hair was the color of honey falling past her shoulders in loose waves that she had pinned partway up in a modest style, though the dry wind blowing through the gaps in the coach door had been working on the pins for 2 hours now, and the style was coming undone in pieces. Her eyes were the color of cornflowers in summer large, an expressive framed by long dark lashes that gave her face the look of a woman who saw more than she said. She had a heart-shaped face and delicate features, a small straight nose, and a full lower lip that was currently pressed against the upper one in a thin line of pure determination. She was small, 5'3" and slender, the kind of build that strangers mistook for fragile until they spent 5 minutes in her company and saw the iron sitting upright in her spine like a steel rod. She looked out the coach window at the vast emptiness of Idaho rolling past and felt both liberated and terrified in equal measure. Every mile that carried her farther from Boston was a mile closer to freedom. But freedom, she was learning, looked an awful lot like nothing. No houses, no church steeples, no cobblestone streets or gaslight or the constant low roar of a city full of people. Just grass and sky and distance stretching out to the curved edge of the world. Her parents had died when she was 19. Fever. The same fever that had moved through the crowded streets of Boston that summer like an invisible hand reaching down chimneys and through window cracks, taking the old and the young and the poor and the comfortable, all without preference or mercy. Her father first in August, her mother 3 weeks later in September. They had left her a small inheritance and very little else. a second cousin in Philadelphia who did not answer letters, an aunt who had moved west somewhere years ago and whose address no one in the family could remember. The Harwood family of Boston had taken her in. They were respectable people, prosperous, with three small children who needed a governess and a large house with empty rooms enough to spare. She had become the governess. A roof over her head, a small wage paid quarterly, the use of the family library in the evenings. She should have been grateful. She had been grateful at first. And then Theodore Vance had decided that he wanted her. He was 30 years old, a distant cousin of the Harwood family on the mother's side, the only son of the Vance shipping fortune. Tall and dark-haired and immaculate in his clothes, the way only a man who had never tied his own cravat could be immaculate. He had gray eyes the color of a January creek bed, flat and reflective, and a smile that he wore the way other men wore expensive watches, as an ornament, as a sign of status, as something he put on when the occasion called for it and took off again when no one was looking. He had not wanted her the way a man wants a woman he loves. He had wanted her the way a man wants a painting for his wall, a horse for his stable, something beautiful to own and display, something that would smile and nod at his dinner parties and never have an opinion about anything that mattered. He had arranged the engagement without asking her opinion. He had spoken to the senior Mr. Harwood about it over brandy in the library one evening, and the matter had been settled by the time the brandy was finished, and Adelaide had been informed the following morning over breakfast that she was to marry Theodore Vance in 6 months' time. Mrs. Harwood had said it the way one might mention that the weather had changed. She had agreed, at first, pressured by the suffocating weight of gratitude, by the sense that she had no other options, by the careful and constant reminders that the Harwoods had taken her in and given her a place, and that this was how a young woman in her position repaid such kindness. But as the wedding date had crept closer, she had seen the truth more clearly with every passing week. Theodore did not want a wife. He wanted a possession. He wanted a decorative object that would smile and nod and never have an opinion about anything that mattered. And Adelaide Whitmore, whatever else she might be, was not an object. 2 months before the wedding, she broke the engagement. The Harwood family had erupted. Ungrateful, they had called her. Selfish. Foolish. They had spoken to her about ruined reputations and damaged social standing and the impossibility of her ever finding another match, and Mrs. Harwood had wept tears that Adelaide had understood even then were not really for her. Theodore's reaction had been colder, more precise, far more frightening. He had come to the Harwood house in the middle of a Tuesday afternoon when the children were at their lessons and Mr. Harwood was at his office, and he had asked to speak with Adelaide alone in the front parlor. She had agreed foolishly because she had still believed at that moment that the worst of the matter was behind her. He had closed the parlor door behind him. He had not sat down. He had stood very close to her, close enough that she could smell the bay rum on his collar, and he had spoken in a voice so quiet that no servant passing in the hallway outside could possibly have heard him. "No one walks out of my life until I say so, Adelaide," he had said. The gray eyes had been flat as winter ice. "You will regret this. I will find you. Wherever you go in this country, however far you run, I will find you. I want you to understand that. I want you to carry that understanding with you everywhere you go for the rest of your natural life." Then he had smiled the ornamental smile, and he had bowed politely, and he had walked out of the parlor and out of the house and into the late autumn afternoon as if nothing of any consequence had been said at all. She had used the last of her parents' inheritance to buy passage west. She had answered an advertisement in the mail-order bride section of a newspaper that came down to Boston by the southern routes, an advertisement placed by a man named Asa Pendleton in Ridgway, Idaho territory. She had answered honestly. She had written about books and about wanting to start fresh and about needing a place where she could finally stop running. She had not written about Theodore. She had not written about the threat. She had not written about the man who might even now be searching for her across an entire continent, because she had been afraid that if she wrote the truth, no decent man would ever accept her. And so she had carried the truth alone, like a small dark stone, in the pocket of her heart. and she had hoped that the distance would be enough, that Idaho was far enough, that 4,000 miles of railroad and stagecoach and mountain road would be a wall too high for even Theodore Vance to climb. That hope, she would later understand, had been the kind of hope a frightened woman tells herself when she has nothing else. The stagecoach broke an axle 15 miles east of Ridgeway. The driver climbed down, cursing, examined the damage, kicked the wheel once for good measure, and then announced to his passengers that they would be camped in the open prairie for at least a day, possibly two, while he sent the relief rider ahead to fetch a wagon and a new axle out from the freight yard in town. Adelaide had looked at the empty road stretching westward toward the mountains. 15 miles. In Boston, 15 miles meant passing through half a dozen towns and villages, past churches and inns and farmhouses, where a traveler could stop and ask for water and direction. Surely here in this open country, it could not be so different. Surely she could walk it in a few hours. It was, she would later admit, the most foolish decision she had ever made in her entire life. The October heat in Idaho was a deceptive thing. Dry and relentless, the sun beating down out of a sky so blue it hurt the eyes to look at it. The wind moving across the plain, hot and gritty, with dust that worked its way into every fold of her clothing and every crack in the leather of her Boston shoes. She walked for 2 hours before the water she carried in a small tin canteen ran out. She walked for another hour in shoes made for cobblestone sidewalks, and not for Idaho gravel. Feeling the blisters rise and burst on the backs of her heels, feeling the leather chafe through her stockings and into the soft skin beneath. The landscape, which had seemed so vast and so beautifully strange from the coach window, now seemed hostile and endless. No shade, no water, no sign of human habitation in any direction. Just grass and rock and sky, and the thin, pale line of the road disappearing toward mountains that did not seem to grow any closer, no matter how many steps she took. Her vision began to blur at the edges. Her legs grew heavy as if she were wading through deep water. Her thoughts scattered like startled birds, and somewhere around the 4th hour, she realized that she had been walking for some time without entirely being aware of her own body, that the small bag in her hand felt enormous, that the sun was no longer behind her but directly overhead and beating down on the crown of her hat. She stopped in the middle of the road. She turned in a slow circle. She saw nothing in any direction except the slow undulation of grass under the wind. And in that moment of pure desperation, Adelaide Whitmore did something she had not done since the night her mother died. She prayed. She did not pray for rescue. She did not pray for water or shade or for someone to come riding down the road and lift her into a saddle and carry her home. She prayed for something simpler and more terrible than any of those things. "Please, God," she whispered, and her voice was so dry that the words came out cracked and small. "Please give me one more chance. Let someone find me. Give me a place where I belong." Then the ground tilted sideways and she fell. 2 prayers, 2 strangers, one standing on a mountaintop at sunset, firing his loneliness into the empty sky. One lying face down in the dust of an Idaho road with the sun burning down on the back of her neck. Neither one of them knew that the other existed in the world. Neither one of them knew that in the strange, invisible arithmetic by which the universe sometimes answers the things we ask of it, their 2 prayers had already been knotted together like 2 strands of the same rope, and were now being pulled slowly and inevitably toward the same point on the map. Hank Brody found her. Hank was a freight driver who hauled supplies between the towns along the Sawtooth Valley. A grizzled man in his 50s with a beard the color of old iron and a pair of patient draft horses, pulling a wagon loaded with flour sacks and tinned goods bound for the general store in Silver City. He had seen plenty of trouble in his time on the freight road. Wagons overturned, travelers robbed. Once a man who had been bitten by a rattlesnake and had not been found for 2 days. So when he came around the long curve of the road that bent south toward the Pendleton Ranch, turning, and he saw the small dark shape lying in the dust ahead of him, he did not hesitate. He pulled the team up. He climbed down. He knelt beside the woman in the navy blue dress, and he checked her pulse at the wrist. There, weak, too fast, but there. He felt the heat of fever burning through her skin like a stove being stoked behind a thin curtain. He made a quick calculation in his head. Doc Whitman was up at the Patterson Ranch this week attending to a child with pneumonia and would not be back in Ridgeway for several days. The Tate Ranch, where Adelaide's aunt lived, was 12 miles south. The Pendleton place, up the western slope of the Sawtooth, was 7 miles north and uphill all the way. Closer. And Rowan Pendleton, whatever else a man might say about him, was the sort of man who would not turn away from a stranger in need. Hank loaded her carefully into the back of the freight wagon among the flour sacks and the tinned goods, propping her head on a folded oilskin so that her face would not be jolted against the boards as the wagon climbed. He clucked his tongue at the horses. The wagon began to move. 2 days had passed since Rowan Pendleton fired his revolver into the sky. He did not remember those 2 days afterward with any particular clarity. He had worked through them the way he worked through all his days splitting wood and mending fence and riding the upper meadows to count cattle. In the gunshot, prayer had begun to seem like something he had only imagined himself doing, the way a man sometimes remembers a vivid dream and is not quite certain whether it actually happened or not. He was repairing a section of the corral fence when the freight wagon came around the bend at the bottom of the long approach road, the team laboring hard against the grade, Hank Brody standing up on the bench seat and waving his hat in the air and shouting Rowan's name across the yard before the wheels had even stopped turning. Rowan dropped his hammer and ran. He reached the wagon as Hank was climbing down from the seat, and he looked into the wagon bed, and there she was, lying among the flour sacks and supply crates, face white as paper, drenched with sweat, the navy blue dress torn and filthy with dust, the honey blonde hair tangled and plastered against her damp forehead and neck. She looked small. She looked broken. She looked like the answer to a prayer he had not yet dared to believe in. "Found her about 10 miles east," Hank said, talking fast, his hands already pulling back the oilskin so Rowan could see her better. "Collapsed on the side of the road. Walking, can you believe it? Walking through this heat with nothing but that little bag. Fever is bad, Rowan. She needs water and rest, and she needs them now. Doc Whitman is up at the Patterson place and won't be back for days. Your place was the closest." Rowan did not hesitate, not for 1 second. "Bring her inside." He climbed up into the wagon bed and slid his arms beneath the unconscious woman. She was lighter than he had expected. He could feel the heat coming off her body through the fabric of her dress, the dry fever burning through her like a slow, steady flame. Her head fell against his shoulder as he lifted her, and a strand of honey-colored hair brushed against the side of his throat, and he carried her down out of the wagon and across the dusty yard and through the front door of his cabin with the slow, careful steps of a man carrying something he was afraid he might break. Hollis was already in the bedroom clearing the bed. Asa was at the well pump hauling up a bucket of cold creek water before anyone had told him to. Rowan laid her gently down on the quilt his mother had sewn in the last winter of her life. He pulled the boots off her swollen feet. He saw the blisters on the backs of her heels, and his jaw clenched tight enough to crack walnut shells. "Put her on your bed," Hank had said from the doorway unnecessarily, and Rowan had not argued, even though it was the only proper bed in the house. Hank left instructions for care. Cool cloths to bring the fever down. Small sips of water, never too much at once, because too much water given too fast to a woman in this condition could do more harm than good. He had to go. He had supplies waiting in Silver City and a schedule he could not afford to break. He clapped Rowan on the shoulder and climbed back into his wagon and disappeared down the road in a cloud of dust, and the three Pendleton brothers stood in the small bedroom looking down at the stranger lying in their oldest brother's bed. That was when Asa saw the bag. He picked it up from where Rowan had set it on the floor by the bedside. He opened it, found the 2 changes of clothes folded with care, found the book with the soft, worn cover, and inside the front cover of the book, folded neatly into a square, he found the letter. His own handwriting, his own words on paper, words he had sent to a woman in Boston 6 weeks ago, words promising truth and respect in a place where she would never need to pretend. The color drained out of Asa's face the way water drains out of a punctured cup. Slowly and with the careful deliberation of a man approaching a rattlesnake that he had thought was dead, He drew the letter out of the bag and held it out to Rowan. You need to read this. Rowan took the letter. He read it once. He read it again. His amber eyes widened and then narrowed. And then he looked up at Asa, and he looked at the woman on the bed, and he looked back at Asa, and the silence in that small bedroom could have crushed stone. What have you done, Asa? It was not really a question. The tone of voice carried no inflection at all. It was the voice of a man asking a thing because he had to ask it, not because he expected an answer that would change anything. But Rowan Pendleton was a man who understood priorities. And right now, the priority was not his own anger. The priority was the stranger burning with fever in his bed, the woman who had traveled 4,000 miles to marry a Pendleton and just happened to have ended up in the wrong Pendleton's arms. We will talk about this, he said to Asa quietly, but not now. He wrung out a cloth in the bucket of cold creek water and laid it across the woman's forehead. His jaw was clenched tight enough to grind teeth. His hands were steady and gentle. He pulled a wooden chair to the bedside and sat down beside her, and his vigil began. For 3 days, Rowan Pendleton did not leave that chair except to bring fresh water from the creek or to relieve himself behind the barn. He changed the cool cloth on her forehead every hour. He used water straight from the creek where it ran past the lower meadow water so cold that it numbed his hands as he drew it from the bucket water that was nothing but the slow, steady melt from the snowfields high above. He dribbled small, careful amounts between her parched lips when she surfaced just enough from the fever to swallow never too much at once, the way he had learned years ago from nursing sick calves through bad winters. He talked to her sometimes, not knowing if she could hear him, telling her about the ranch in his low, rough voice, telling her about the weather, telling her about the way the morning light came down through the timber on the east ridge and turned the dew on the blue bunch grass into something that looked almost like a field of silver coins. Anything to fill the silence, anything to make the room feel less like a death watch and more like a place where someone might wake up. Hollis took over every chore on the ranch without being asked. He fed the chickens. He checked the cattle in the upper meadows. He repaired the section of corral fence that Rowan had been working on when the wagon arrived. He brought firewood up to the cabin in armloads twice the size of what he could comfortably carry. That was Hollis's way. He did not offer words of comfort because he did not believe in words of comfort. He offered action instead. Silent, steady, unfailing action. Asa cooked. Simple things. Porridge and broth and the strong black coffee that he carried up to Rowan every few hours, setting the tin cup on the bedside table without speaking the way a penitent leaves an offering on an altar. It was his way of apologizing, not with words, not with arguments or excuses, with the quiet, constant, undeniable reminder that he was still here, still family, still trying. On the second night, very deep in the small hours after midnight, when the oil lamp on the bedside table had burned low and Rowan had dozed off in his chair, with his chin sunk down against his chest, the woman's eyes opened for the first time. Cornflower blue, glazed with fever, unable quite to focus. She tried to sit up. Rowan came awake instantly and pressed her shoulder gently back down against the pillow. You need to rest, he said, his voice softer than he had ever heard it leaving his own throat. You are safe here. Her eyes found his face in the dim glow of the lamp. Fear and confusion swirled together in the blue. Where? She whispered. The word was barely a word at all. Dry, cracked, like old leather. My ranch, about 15 miles outside of Ridgeway. A freight driver found you collapsed on the road and brought you here. You have a fever, but you are going to be all right. I promise. Something in his tone reached her. Not the words themselves, but the weight behind them. The quiet certainty of a man who did not make promises he could not keep. She relaxed back against the pillow and her eyes searched his face for another long moment. Thirsty, she whispered. He poured fresh water from the pitcher into the tin cup. He cradled her head with his free hand, lifting it gently from the pillow so she could drink without choking, and his hand was enormous against the back of her skull, calloused and scarred across the knuckles. The hand of a man who had spent his whole adult life working with wood and iron and stone. But he held her head as though she were made of porcelain, And even through the fog of fever, Adelaide Whitmore registered the strange, beautiful incongruity of it. This gentleness from these rough hands. She drank the entire cup. He would not let her have any more. A little more soon, he promised. She nodded weakly. Her eyes drifted closed, and she was asleep again before he had even set the cup back on the bedside table. The fever broke in the early hours of the third morning. Rowan, who had dozed off again in the wooden chair, woke to find her watching him in the pale gray light filtering through the bedroom window before dawn. The frightening crimson flush was gone from her face. Her cheeks were a more natural pallor now. Her eyes were clear and alert, and they were studying him with an expression he could not entirely read. "Hello," she said softly. There was a faint embarrassment in her face. "I am sorry for the trouble." Rowan stood up quickly. He was stiff from 3 nights in a wooden chair, and his back protested loudly as he straightened, and he had to take a breath before he could answer her. "No trouble at all. How are you feeling?" "Like someone who walked through a desert in October without enough water." A small smile crossed her face, weak but real. "Which is exactly what I did. Foolish of me." And then came the moment that shifted everything between them. She asked him why he had cared for her, a complete stranger. She asked it directly without softening the question with politeness or apology, and Rowan heard in her voice something that surprised him. Not gratitude, suspicion. The careful, watchful suspicion of a person who had learned somewhere along the way that kindness usually came with a price. "That is what a decent man does," he said simply. Adelaide was quiet for a long moment, studying his face the way a person studies a contract before signing it. Then she spoke, and for the first time, Rowan heard the sharp intelligence behind the delicate features alive in the fever-weakened voice. "In Boston, I lived with people who called themselves decent. They gave me a home and clothes and an education. But every act of decency came with a price they collected when it suited them." She paused. Her cornflower blue eyes did not leave his face. "Your decency, Mr. Pendleton. What does it cost?" He looked at her then, really looked, and he understood that this was not the helpless girl he had been assuming her to be for 3 days. This was someone who had been hurt enough times to stop believing in kindness that came without conditions. And the recognition of that, strange as it was, made him respect her instantly. "No cost," he said, "except that when you are well, I will need you to explain the letter in your bag, the one addressed to my brother Asa." She closed her eyes for a moment. When she opened them, she did not look frightened. She looked tired. "That will be a long conversation, Mr. Pendleton. I have nothing but time." That afternoon, while she slept again, Rowan went out onto the porch. The October sun was thin and cold, but the sky was a clean, hard blue, and from the porch he could see for 50 miles across the valley to the Bitterroot foothills in the distance. He stood at the porch rail for a long while, saying nothing. Hollis came out and stood beside him. He did not speak either. The two brothers stood together in the kind of silence that had been their normal manner of communication since they were boys. After a long time, Hollis spoke. "There were tracks at the eastern fence line this morning." Rowan did not turn his head. "What kind of tracks?" "Boot prints. 2 pair, not ranch boots, heeled, narrow. The kind of boot a man buys in a city store and wears once before he comes out west." Rowan let that sit in the cold air between them for a long moment. "How recent?" "Last night, sometime after midnight. They came up through the timber and stood at the edge of the tree line for maybe an hour. Then they went back the way they came." "How do you know they stood for an hour?" 2 cigarette stubs, Eastern tobacco, expensive." Rowan finally turned his head and looked at his middle brother. Hollis's green eyes were flat and steady, and there was no expression at all on his weathered face. But Rowan had known him for 25 years, and he could read the slight tightness around the mouth as clearly as if Hollis had written the words out on a piece of paper. "You think they are watching the cabin. I think they are watching her." Rowan looked back out across the valley. The wind moved across the high meadow grass, and somewhere down by the creek, a hawk cried out once sharp and high and lonely. "Do not tell her yet," he said. "I was not going to." They stood together for another long while, two brothers looking at a horizon that suddenly seemed less peaceful than it had the day before. From inside the cabin came the small sound of Adelaide stirring in the bed, then the murmur of Asa's voice speaking to her softly through the open bedroom door, and then her own voice answering back weak but unafraid. Out beyond the tree line, somewhere in the deep timber where the boot prints had been, a single pale wisp of smoke rose for just a moment above the pines, and then was gone like the breath of something patient, and watching that had no intention of leaving. The first morning Adelaide was strong enough to walk the property, Asa was the one who gave her the tour. She came out onto the porch wrapped in one of Rowan's flannel shirts over her own dress, because the October air had a real bite to it now, and her own coat was still being mended by the wood stove where Asa had spread it out the night before. The shirt swallowed her, the cuffs hung past her fingertips, and the shoulders sat halfway down her arms, and when Asa came around the corner of the cabin carrying an armload of split kindling and saw her standing there in his brother's shirt, looking like a child wearing her father's church coat, he stopped walking for just 1 second too long before he remembered himself and kept moving. He showed her the cabin first. 5 rooms of hand-split pine and riverstone, the walls thick enough that even in the deepest cold of January, the inside stayed warm with a single bank fire in the kitchen stove. He showed her the cast iron stove itself, 200 pounds of black metal that the three brothers had hauled up the mountain in pieces and assembled in the kitchen over the course of one entire week. He showed her the barn, 6 stalls, 3 of them currently occupied. A wild Mustang mare named Stardark Brown with a white star on her forehead that had given her the name and 2 working geldings that Rowan and Hollis used for ranch labor. Star nuzzled Asa's hand through the slats of her stall, the way a house cat rubs against its owner's leg, and Adelaide watched the gesture with quiet wonder. "You broke her yourself," she said. It was not a question. "Took me a whole summer. She is the best horse I will ever own. She remembers everything." He showed her the well that Hollis had dug by hand over the course of 2 summers, 40 feet straight down through hard pan and clay, and finally into clean cold water that was so cold it would make your teeth ache if you drank it too fast. He showed her the root cellar dug into the hillside behind the cabin, the smokehouse where Hollis cured venison and elk and made sausages that would see them through winter, the small kitchen garden where the last potatoes and carrots of the season were still waiting to be pulled before the first hard freeze drove them deep into the ground for good. She took it all in with the wide eyes of someone who had never before been more than 3 blocks from a cobblestone street. The smells were different here. Not coal smoke and sewage and horse manure baking on hot summer pavement, pine resin, cold creek water, wood smoke from the cabin chimney, the clean smell of earth that had been frozen and then thawed and then frozen again. The sounds were different. No clatter of carriages on the streets, no vendors shouting from corners, no church bells marking the quarter hours. Just wind, just a creek somewhere down the slope, just the distant lowing of cattle from the upper meadow, and once somewhere very high overhead, the long sharp cry of a hawk riding the thermals. "It is very quiet," she said. "You will get used to it." "I am not sure I want to get used to it. I am not sure I want it to ever stop being beautiful." Asa looked at her then, and he saw that her cornflower blue eyes were shining with something he could not quite name, and he had to look away quickly because he was 22 years old, and he had written a letter 6 weeks ago for his brother, and looking at her too long felt like something he was not permitted to do. She learned the rhythms of the ranch with a speed that surprised all 3 brothers. Rowan rose before anyone else. Always. He had been rising in the dark since he was 18 years old, and his body no longer required an alarm or a rooster or any other natural signal to bring him up out of sleep. He simply opened his eyes at 4:30 in the morning, swung his feet down to the cold pine floor, dressed in the dark, and built up the fire in the kitchen stove before grinding the coffee beans in the stone mortar that had belonged to his mother. The smell of that coffee, rough and smoky and mixed with the oak smoke of the rebuilt fire. That smell drifting under Adelaide's bedroom door in the cold blue hour before dawn would become the smell she would forever associate with the word home for the rest of her life. Isa fed the chickens and milked the cow. The cow was a placid Jersey he had named Duchess because when he had bought her as a calf from old Henderson down the road, she had a way of holding her head as if she expected to be addressed by title. Hollis checked his trap lines and scouted the perimeter at first light, reading the tracks and signs the way other men read newspapers, learning the small story of the previous night, written across the snowless ground in the language of mice and elk, and the occasional careful prints of a mountain lion. By the time breakfast was over, the real work began. Fence mending, wood splitting, moving cattle from one grazing meadow to another, repairing the barn roof before winter came howling down off the peaks in earnest. The thousand small tasks of frontier life that meant the difference between thriving through the cold months and simply surviving them. Adelaide burned her first batch of pancakes. Asa ate them anyway, declaring them to be character building. She learned to gather eggs from chickens that fought her for every single one, pecking her knuckles bloody until she figured out the trick of slipping her hand underneath them from behind. She learned that a morning in Idaho could start at 60 degrees with the sun rising over the eastern ridge and drop to below freezing by noon if the wind shifted out of the north. She learned that the creek water was cold enough to numb your hands in 15 seconds and clean enough to drink straight from the rocks without boiling. And she learned slowly through watching and listening and asking questions that showed genuine curiosity rather than polite courtesy, the thousand small details of frontier life that meant the difference between living on this mountain and merely staying alive on it. Asa taught her to ride. He was patient with her in a way that surprised her. Cheerful, picking her up off the ground the third time she fell out of the saddle without a single trace of mockery in his warm amber eyes. "Boston girl," he said, grinning, dusting the dirt off the back of her dress with a careful, brotherly hand. "A horse is not a carriage. It has opinions of its own." She laughed. It was the first time she had laughed since arriving in Idaho, and the sound carried clear across the yard to where Rowan was repairing a fence post 50 yards away. He stopped. The hammer was raised above his head mid-swing, and he stopped it in the air and simply stood there listening. Something about that laugh, warm and unexpected and real, made the tightness in his chest ease by some small fraction that he could not have measured if he tried. He brought the hammer down. He drove the nail home in 3 steady blows. He did not look across the yard at her, but he was smiling very slightly behind the brim of his hat where no one could see. In the evenings by the fire, Adelaide taught Asa to read better. He could manage words. He was not illiterate. But he was slow sounding out syllables like a boy half his age, and there were whole columns of the Ridgeway Gazette that he simply skipped over because the longer words defeated him. Adelaide used her mother's book as a textbook. She was patient with him the way good teachers are patient, correcting without condescension, praising the small victories, letting him struggle through a difficult sentence, and then quietly supplying the word he needed only when he had truly given up on finding it himself. Hollis, uninvited, sat in the corner during these lessons. He never said a word. He pretended to be cleaning his rifle or carving or simply staring into the fire. But Adelaide noticed after the first week that his lips were moving very slightly when she read aloud, shaping the words along with her. And she understood then that he was learning too in his own silent way. And she made sure from that night onward to read clearly and slowly enough that the man in the corner could keep up without ever having to ask. Hollis taught her to read the woods. He had not offered. He had simply come up beside her one morning when she was walking toward the creek with a bucket, and he had pointed at a set of tracks in the soft mud beside the path and said, "Bare black, young one. Came through last night sometime after the dew settled." She stared at the tracks. She would have walked past them without noticing. "How can you tell it is young?" Stride is short, print is small, maybe 2 years old, looking for berries. He will not come back this far again. Too close to the cabin smell. She asked him after that, and he answered. He showed her the difference between a rattlesnake and a bull snake, explained which sounds in the forest were normal, and which meant that a predator was nearby. He taught her that the birds went quiet before a storm, and that they went quiet again in a different way when something dangerous was moving through the timber. When she asked him once how he had learned so much, he answered with the brevity that was his particular trademark. The mountain teaches if you live long enough to learn. Then the first storm came. Hollis saw it first. He stepped out onto the porch at dawn with his coffee cup in his hand, and he looked at the sky and he looked at the mountains, and he saw the black clouds stacking themselves up over the sawtooth peaks like the slow, steady piling of stones, one on top of another. The wind shifting out of the northwest, the air carrying that particular metallic smell that always preceded the first real snow of the season. He did not finish his coffee. He set the cup down on the porch rail and went back inside, and he spoke two words. Storm coming, bad one, before noon. What followed was a masterclass in frontier teamwork. Rowan and Hollis rode out together to push the cattle off the upper meadow and into a natural stone windbreak on the lee side of the ridge, where they would be sheltered from the worst of the wind. Asa stayed at the cabin to reinforce the barn, hammering loose boards back into place, spreading extra straw for the horses, double tying the door against the gusts that would soon come tearing down off the peaks. And Adelaide worked. She did not stand inside the cabin and wait. She hauled firewood, smaller loads than the brothers could carry, but she hauled it stack after stack from the wood pile to the indoor wood box until her arms shook and her back ached, and her breath came in small white clouds in the cold cabin air. She chased the chickens into the coop, one by one, getting pecked twice and cursing under her breath, in language she had picked up not in the Harwood drawing rooms, but in the back kitchens of the Harwood servants. She had hot soup ready on the stove by the time all three brothers came stumbling in, red-faced and half-frozen, stamping snow off their boots and slapping their gloved hands against their thighs to bring the feeling back. They sat around the kitchen table, soup steaming, fire roaring in the stove, snow falling so thickly through the kitchen window that the barn 20 yards away across the yard was nothing but a dim gray shape behind a wall of white. Four people who had been strangers 6 weeks ago, huddled together against the storm. And for the first time since Adelaide had arrived at the Pendleton Ranch, the cabin felt like something more than a house. It felt like a home. Hollis, who almost never spoke during meals, looked down into his bowl and said two words, "Good soup." From Hollis, that was the equivalent of a standing ovation in a Boston opera house. Adelaide smiled. Asa hooted with laughter and slapped the table hard enough to make the spoons jump. Hollis complimented cooking. Mark the calendar. Hollis complimented cooking. Somebody write this down. This has never happened before in the history of the Pendleton family. And Rowan, the most guarded of them all, the man who had built his walls so high and so thick that not even his own brothers could always see what was behind them, allowed the faintest smile to cross his face. He hid it behind his coffee cup, but it was there, and Adelaide saw it. "We will get through this," Rowan said, a simple sentence, aimed at the storm. But it meant something deeper than that, and everyone in the room knew it, and no one said a single word in reply, because some truths are too important to be diminished by acknowledgement. She was learning to live on this mountain, but the mountain was not done teaching, and the next lesson would change everything between Adelaide and Rowan forever. It was a clear morning a week after the first snow had fallen and melted. Adelaide was alone by the chicken coop, gathering eggs in her apron, humming a small song under her breath that her mother used to hum in the kitchen in Boston. The sun was just coming up over the eastern ridge, and the world was sharp-edged and bright, with that particular clarity that only happens after a hard frost. She heard the noise behind her, a heavy sound, not the sound of the brothers, not the sound of horses. She turned. The black bear was 20 feet away from her. Not a grizzly, a black bear. Young by the look of him, 2 or 3 years old, drawn down out of the timber by the smell of the chicken feed and the eggs. But to a woman from Boston, who had never seen anything more dangerous than a runaway carriage on Beacon Street, it might as well have been a dragon. Adelaide froze. The bear stopped 20 feet away, sniffing the air, his great dark shape blocking out the morning sun. Every instinct she had was screaming at her to run, but her legs would not obey her. She could not move. She could not breathe. The apron full of eggs hung from her hand, and one of the eggs slipped out and fell to the ground and broke open at her feet, and she could not even look down. Then Rowan was there. He came from the barn like a force of nature. He had heard the bear before he had seen Adelaide had read the silence of the chickens the way Hollis read tracks, and he had crossed the 50 yards of open yard in a hard, fast run that Adelaide did not even register until he was already past her, stepping between her body and the bear with one fluid motion. He did not draw his gun. Instead, he spread his arms wide at his full height of 6'5", and he roared. It was a sound that came from somewhere deep in his chest. Primal, enormous, a sound that shook the cold morning air and seemed to make the very ground vibrate. The bear, confronted with something that suddenly appeared even larger and more dangerous than itself, wheeled around and crashed back into the tree line at a dead run, the snapping of brush and the thud of heavy paws fading away into the distance. Rowan turned, and for the first time since Adelaide had known him, the concern on his face was completely unhidden. The granite mask was gone. The careful distance was gone. There was nothing in his face except naked, raw, helpless fear, and it was all for her. "Are you all right?" He put his hand on her shoulder. A big hand, calloused and warm. The hand of a man who had carried her unconscious through his own front door, and who had sat by her bed for 3 nights, and who had held her head with that same hand while she drank water from a tin cup. Adelaide, still trembling, looked up at him. The difference in their heights meant that he was bent slightly forward to be closer to her face, and the distance between them was only inches now. Amber eyes met cornflower blue. And in that moment, something shifted between them. Something that could not be taken back. Something that did not need words and would not have been improved by them if it had. "I am fine," she said, "because of you." Rowan pulled his hand away quickly, as if her shoulder had burned him through the fabric of her dress. "Do not go out alone. Not yet. Not until you have a rifle and know how to use it." He turned and walked fast toward the barn. He did not look back, and Adelaide watched him go, her heart hammering so hard she could feel it in the tips of her fingers, the apron of eggs still hanging forgotten from her hand. After that day, small things began to change. Rowan cut his hair neater. He had Asa do it one evening on the porch, sitting on a stump, while his youngest brother worked carefully with the kitchen scissors and a tin mirror. He started changing into a clean shirt before dinner, instead of sitting down at the table in the dust-covered work shirt he had been wearing all day. He shaved every other morning now instead of every third. And every evening when he rode back from checking the cattle on the upper pasture, he brought wildflowers. Not a bouquet, just a few stems. Whatever was blooming despite the cold. Late-season asters, a sprig of mountain laurel, once a single early goldenrod that he must have ridden a mile out of his way to find. He placed them on the windowsill of Adelaide's bedroom without ever saying a single word about them, and he never acknowledged them when she thanked him at dinner, and Adelaide understood after the 3rd day that this was something she was not supposed to mention out loud, and so she stopped mentioning it. But every morning, the moment she woke up, she looked at the windowsill first. Asa nearly commented on this new habit one evening at dinner. He had opened his mouth, the grin already forming the joke half assembled in his head, and Hollis kicked him hard under the table before the words could form, and Asa closed his mouth again without speaking. Adelaide, for her part, began transforming the cabin from a place where men lived into a place where people lived. Curtains she sewed from fabric she bought in Ridgeway. Cushions for the hard wooden chairs around the kitchen table. A cloth for the dinner table, plain white, hemmed by her own hand in the evenings while she sat by the fire. And the thing that moved Rowan most of all, she found the one remaining photograph of his parents in a tin box in the back of his bedroom closet. A tintype, faded almost to invisibility but still legible if you held it to the light. She did not ask his permission. She simply took it down to Ridgeway one afternoon with Asa, and she had the local photographer make a proper print of it, and she had Asa carve a small wooden frame for it. And one evening when Rowan came in from the barn for dinner, he found his parents looking back at him from the wall of the front room where everyone could see them. He stood very still for a long time looking at that picture. He did not speak. He did not turn his head to find Adelaide or to thank her. He simply stood there with his hat in his hand, and he looked at his mother and his father, and after a few minutes, Adelaide quietly went back into the kitchen and gave him the privacy he needed. But that evening, the wildflowers on her windowsill were larger than any day before. A whole handful of them this time. Late asters and goldenrod, and a single stem of something purple she could not even name. She held the flowers in her hand for a long time before she set them in the water glass. Their first real argument came over a visit to Ridgeway. Rowan said she needed to stay with her aunt for propriety's sake. A single woman living unmarried with 3 unmarried men was not something polite society would approve of. And even out here on the frontier, there was such a thing as a reputation. And once a reputation was damaged, it could not always be repaired. "I do not need their approval," Adelaide said, her voice going cold in a way that he had not heard before. "I spent my whole life living by other people's rules. I came here to live by mine. I am trying to protect you. I do not need protection from gossip. I need to not be a burden." There was a silence then. The kitchen was empty except for the two of them, Asa and Hollis, having both made strategic exits some minutes earlier. Rowan stood with one hand on the back of a chair, his amber eyes searching her face, and when he spoke again, his voice was softer. "You are not a burden, Adelaide." It was the first time he had ever used her given name. She looked at him. The anger drained out of her face, replaced by something warmer and far more frightening to both of them. "Then do not decide for me. Ask me what I want." "What do you want?" "To stay here until I decide otherwise." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he nodded once slowly, as a man might nod when accepting the terms of a contract he had not expected to agree to. "All right." They drove to Ridgeway the next day anyway, but for a different purpose. Adelaide's Aunt Bess Tate was a warm woman in her late 40s, with her dead sister's eyes, and she recognized her niece instantly across the dusty main street and pulled her into an embrace that was half laughter and half tears. Walter Tate Bess's husband shook Rowan's hand with a look that said he was measuring the man against the responsibility of looking after his niece, and the handshake went on a beat too long, and Rowan understood every silent word of what Walter was saying without a single syllable being spoken aloud. On the ride back up the mountain in the late afternoon, the wagon rolling through country painted gold and crimson by the setting sun, Adelaide broke the comfortable silence between them. "Asa told me about the night you fired your gun at the sky and prayed." Rowan stiffened on the bench seat beside her. "The boy talks too much." "Are you ashamed of it?" "Yes. Do not be. I prayed too." He turned his head and looked at her. The wagon rolled on. The horse's hooves made a slow, steady rhythm against the packed dirt of the road. "When I was walking through that heat," she said quietly, "when I thought I was going to die out there on that road, and that no one would even find my body, I asked God for one more chance. I asked him to let someone find me, to give me a place where I belonged." She paused. "And then Hank Brody came down the road, and then you were there." Something passed between them in that moment, an acknowledgement that their connection ran deeper than coincidence, deeper than a letter written in secret by a well-meaning younger brother, deeper than a broken axle and a foolish decision to walk 15 miles in October heat. Something closer to destiny. Rowan wanted to reach for her hand, wanted to tell her that he had been thinking the exact same thing every night for the past 3 weeks. But he held back, afraid of moving too fast, afraid of frightening away the best thing that had ever happened to him. "Winter always ends," he said quietly, and Adelaide understood that he was not talking about the weather. That night, for the first time since she had come to live at the Pendleton Ranch, Adelaide did not bolt her bedroom door. She was not entirely sure what it meant, but she thought perhaps he would understand. He did. He noticed the unbolted door when he passed it in the hallway on his way to bed, and he stood there for a moment in the dark hallway looking at the door that was unlocked but closed, and he did not open it. He simply touched the door frame once with his fingertips, very gently, as a man might touch the door frame of a church he believed in but did not deserve to enter, and then he went on to his own room. What Adelaide had not yet told Rowan, what she had been carrying alone, like a small dark stone in the pocket of her heart, since the day she stepped off the eastbound train in Boston was about Theodore Vance. She had told Rowan that she had broken an engagement. She had told him the family had been furious. She had told him the man had been cold, but she had not told him about the words that had been spoken in the front parlor of the Harwood house on that Tuesday afternoon. She had not told him about the threat. She had not told him that the man she was running from was the kind of man who kept his promises the way a snake keeps its venom, always ready, always waiting. She had not told him because she was afraid. Not of Theodore, not anymore. She had crossed a continent to get away from Theodore, and the further west she had traveled, the smaller he had become in her mind, until by the time she had crossed the Missouri, he had been only a name attached to an unpleasant memory, and by the time she had reached Idaho, he had been almost nothing at all. She had been afraid of something else. She had been afraid that if Rowan knew, if he understood the full weight of what she had brought to his doorstep, he would send her away. Not out of cruelty, out of duty. He would decide that the safest thing for everyone on this mountain would be to remove the source of the danger, and the source of the danger was her. And Adelaide could not bear the thought of being sent away from this mountain. Not now. Not when the wildflowers kept appearing on her windowsill every morning, placed there by hands that would never admit to placing them. Not when the porch conversations had become the things she looked forward to most in every single day. Not when the word home had started to mean something to her again for the first time in 3 years. She should have told him sooner. She would realize that later, when the cost of her silence would be measured in blood. It was Hollis who found the first real sign. Not the boot prints at the fence line which had been the first warning days earlier. Something more. He was on his morning patrol, moving through the timber above the ranch with the silent precision that was as natural to him as breathing, when his sharp green eyes caught what most men would have missed entirely. A second set of boot prints joining the first. A third. The same heeled city boots in different sizes now. And beside one set of prints, ground carefully into the frozen earth, as if someone had wanted to leave a mark, a fresh cigarette stub. Expensive tobacco. Eastern brand. The kind a man bought in Boston for $1 a tin. Hollis picked up the stub. He held it to his nose. He memorized the smell. Then he followed the tracks backward through the trees, reading the story they told the way another man might read a letter. One man initially. Then 2 more had joined him. They had come from the south, up the main trail, and then they had left the trail about a mile from the ranch and moved through the forest to reach this observation post. They had stood here for some time, long enough to smoke, long enough to watch, long enough to plan. He went back to the cabin and reported to Rowan with his usual economy of words. 3 of them now, not just one. They are camped about 2 miles south of here in the deep timber. New rifles, good horses. Boots are city-made. They are watching the trail, the only road in or out. Rowan's jaw tightened until the muscle in his cheek stood out like a knot of rope. From that moment, the rifle stayed within arm's reach. Adelaide was not to be out of sight when she was outdoors. The porch conversations continued, but now Rowan sat facing the tree line, and Hollis took his coffee out to the porch at random hours of the night and stood in the dark listening to the woods and the small, peaceful rhythm of the ranch that had been building over the past weeks now had a thin, invisible thread of tension running through it like a wire pulled tight beneath the surface of everything. Then the letter came. Aunt Bess rode up the mountain road on a cold morning with an envelope in her coat pocket and worry carved deep into her face. The letter had arrived at the Ridgeway post office 3 days earlier, addressed in an elegant Boston hand to Adelaide Whitmore, in care of Mrs. Walter Tate. Bess, who knew the postmaster and who had been receiving Adelaide's mail on her behalf, had opened it. She had read it once, and then she had saddled her horse without telling Walter where she was going, and she had ridden 15 miles of mountain road in under 2 hours, because Margaret Tate was a frontier woman who understood that speed was the difference between a problem and a tragedy. She found Rowan in the yard splitting wood. The axe was raised above his head when he saw her face, and the axe came down slowly without striking the log. She handed him the letter without speaking. He read it. The handwriting was precise and elegant, the penmanship of a man who had been educated at the finest schools in the East and who wielded language the way other men wielded weapons. Adelaide, did you think distance could hide you from me? I have sent men to find you and they have found you. I am giving you 1 week to return to Boston voluntarily. If you do not, I will come personally. And believe me when I tell you that the ranchers you are living with will not enjoy the consequences. Yours, Theodore Vance. Rowan read it twice. He folded it carefully in half. He set it down on the chopping block beside him, and he looked at Aunt Bess, and then he looked toward the cabin where Adelaide was inside helping Asa peel potatoes for supper. "Come inside, Margaret," he said quietly. "She needs to see this." The conversation that followed took place in the kitchen with the fire banked low and the soup gone cold on the stove. Adelaide read the letter once. Then she read it again. Her hands were trembling by the second reading, but her face was very still. And when she finally looked up at Rowan, her cornflower blue eyes were full of unshed tears that she refused to let fall. "You should have told me," he said. His voice was quiet, the kind of quiet that was more dangerous than any shout. "I know, I was afraid." "Afraid of what?" "That you would send me away, that I would become a burden instead of—" She stopped, she swallowed. "Instead of what?" "Instead of someone worth keeping." The silence in that kitchen was absolute. The fire popped softly in the stove. The wind pressed against the cabin walls. And Rowan Pendleton, who had spent 5 years building walls around his heart that no one could breach, felt them crack. Not break, not yet, but crack the way ice cracks on a river in spring, thin lines spreading outward from a single point of pressure. He took 2 steps across the kitchen and he stopped in front of her. He did not touch her. He simply stood there looking down at her, and when he spoke, his voice was rougher and lower than she had ever heard it. "You are not a burden, Adelaide, and no one will take you from here. Not unless you want to go home. That is a promise. A man keeps his word." She closed her eyes. 2 tears slipped out from under her lashes and ran down her cheeks, and she did not wipe them away. Hollis took the letter from the table without speaking. He folded it once and slid it into his shirt pocket. He took his rifle from the wall pegs, in his coat from the back of the chair, and he walked out the cabin door without a single word to anyone, and the door closed behind him with a soft, solid click. He was gone for 6 hours. When he came back, his report was delivered in the flat, precise tone of a man cataloging facts that had no emotion attached to them at all. 3 men, camped in the timber 2 miles south of the ranch on the South Fork of Pine Creek. Good horses, well rested, new Winchester rifles, city boots, all 3 of them. They had a fresh fire going and they were drinking coffee from tin cups that had been bought new in Ridgeway sometime in the past week. They were waiting for orders by the look of them. Patient, not yet ready to move. Asa, for the first time since Adelaide had known him, lost his smile. His face hardened into something older and more serious than his 22 years should have allowed. "I brought her here," he said to Rowan. His voice was steady but very low. "This is my responsibility." Rowan shook his head once. "She is here. She belongs here. This is the responsibility of all of us." It was the first time he had said that Adelaide belonged. Not that she could stay, not that she was welcome to remain as a guest for as long as she liked. That she belonged. And Adelaide, hearing it, felt something break open in her chest that she had been keeping sealed for a very long time. The ambush came 3 days later. Hollis left the ranch before dawn the way he always did. He rode the dun gelding he had trained himself, the horse that knew how to move through timber without snapping a single branch underfoot. He carried his father's Winchester, the stock worn smooth where 4 generations of Pendleton hands had gripped it. His intent was to track the watchers, to learn their patterns, to understand their movements well enough to predict their next step. He found their new observation post on a rocky outcrop above the main trail. The boot prints were clearer here. 2 men this time, not 3. The third must have been sent back down to Ridgeway with a message. He saw fresh cigarette butts beside a flat stone that had served as a seat. They had been here since before dawn. He felt the danger before he understood it. It was a sensation that years of living in wild country had refined to an instinct as reliable as sight or hearing. The forest changed when a predator was near. The birds went quiet in a particular way. The wind carried a faint metallic edge that did not belong to the mountain. Something in the very quality of the air itself shifted, became charged the way the air charges before lightning strikes. He started to turn his horse, 1 second too late. The first rifle shot came from the pine cover 30 yards to his left. It struck the gelding in the neck just below the jaw, and the animal went down hard, its forelegs folding beneath it. Hollis was thrown from the saddle, hitting the frozen ground with a force that drove the breath from his lungs and sent his hat rolling. The second shot found him while he was still falling, punching through the muscle on the left side of his rib cage, grazing the 10th rib so hard that he felt the bone splinter even before the pain arrived. The pain, when it came, was immediate and enormous, a white-hot line of fire that traced from his side around to his spine. But Hollis Pendleton had been surviving on this mountain since he was 20 years old. Pain was familiar. Panic was not an option. His body responded before his mind caught up. He rolled hard behind the trunk of a ponderosa pine, 3 feet thick, dragging the Winchester with him by the sling. His left arm pressed tight against the wound to slow the bleeding. His hands were shaking, but his grip on the rifle was steady. Instinct was stronger than agony. He fired twice, not to kill, to suppress, to buy time. The shots cracked through the branches where the muzzle flashes had appeared, and the sharp sound of splitting wood told him he was close enough to make the attackers think twice. They retreated. He heard the sound of boots crashing through undergrowth moving away to the south. 2 sets of footfalls, both running. He tore a strip from his shirt with his teeth and bound it around his midsection, pulling it tight enough to make his vision gray at the edges. The bleeding slowed but did not stop entirely. He began crawling toward the ranch, dragging himself across the carpet of frozen pine needles and brittle leaves, leaving a dark red trail on the earth behind him. Half a mile. That was all he needed. He made it about 400 yards before his body quit. He rolled onto his back on the thin crust of early snow and stared up at the gray sky through the pine branches, his rifle still clutched in his right hand, because a Pendleton did not let go of his weapon, and his green eyes began to close. Rowan heard the gunshots from the ranch. 2 distant reports, then 2 more, the sound rolling across the valley like far-off thunder. He was saddled and riding within 30 seconds. He did not wait for Asa. He did not wait to grab a coat. He rode out of the yard with his rifle across the pommel of the saddle and his coatless arms aching from the cold wind, and he found Hollis 400 yards into the timber. Lying in the patchy snow with his eyes shut and his face the color of ash, and the blood soaking through the makeshift bandage and spreading across the white ground in a pattern that looked like spilled paint. Rowan dropped from his horse and knelt beside his brother. His fingers found the pulse at Hollis's neck. There, weak, too fast, but there, still beating, still alive. He got his arms underneath Hollis's back and he lifted him. 190 pounds of dead weight, but the adrenaline made it feel like nothing, like lifting a child. He draped Hollis across the saddle of his horse, one hand holding his brother in place, the other gripping the reins, and he prayed the horse into a gallop toward home. Asa heard the hoofbeats and came running from the barn with a rifle in each hand. Adelaide stood in the cabin doorway. She watched Rowan thunder into the yard. Hollis draped across the horse like a sack of grain, blood running in a slow, steady stream down the horse's white belly and dripping into the dust. And she saw Rowan's face, the face that was always composed, always controlled, always the granite mask of a man who carried the world on his shoulders without complaint. That face was white, bloodless. His amber eyes, usually so sharp and steady, were wild with a terror she had never seen in them before and hope she would never see again. "Hollis," Rowan said. One word, his voice cracked on it like wood splitting. Adelaide made her choice in a single heartbeat. "Rowan, boil water, 3 pots, now." Her voice came out calm and clear and commanding in a way that surprised even herself. Asa, every clean cloth in this house, tear them into strips and bring the whiskey, not for drinking. Rowan, who was accustomed to giving orders and not to taking them, looked at Adelaide, 5'3", hands already red with Hollis's blood from helping lift him down off the horse. And in her cornflower blue eyes was a steadiness that he recognized because it was the same steadiness he saw in his own mirror on his worst days. The steadiness of someone who knew what needed to be done and would not stop until it was done. He obeyed. Not because he was weak, because she was right. Because in this moment, knowledge mattered more than muscle. Because the woman from Boston who could not saddle a horse 6 weeks ago was now the only person on this mountain who knew how to save his brother's life. She had read the medical books in the Harwood Library on the long, lonely evenings when Theodore was at his parties and she was alone in that vast, empty house. She had read them cover to cover. Anatomy, surgical technique, wound care, knowledge that had been entirely theoretical until this exact moment, and that was now suddenly the only thing standing between Hollis Pendleton and the cold earth of the burying hill. She examined the wound with practiced fingers, pressing gently but thoroughly. The bullet had passed through cleanly, entry wound on the left side, exit wound in the back, no lodged projectile. She listened to his breathing. No rasping, no bubbling, no whistling. The lung was intact. The blood was dark, not bright, flowing steadily but not spurting. Muscle wound, not arterial. "He will live," she said, and Rowan, standing in the doorway holding a steaming pot of boiling water, nearly dropped it from the sheer force of his relief. "If we prevent infection." She turned back to her work, and the long night began. For 3 days and 3 nights, Adelaide Whitmore did not leave Hollis Pendleton's side except to wash her hands and to sleep in stolen fragments of an hour at a time in the wooden chair beside his bed. She cleaned the wound first with water that had been boiled and then cooled to the precise temperature that the medical books had specified. She cleaned it again with whiskey from the bottle Asa had brought in from the cellar, and when the liquor hit the raw, torn flesh, Hollis, half-conscious and barely tethered to the world, snarled with pain and then managed to mutter a protest so weak it was almost comical. "That was good whiskey." Adelaide, not missing a beat, replied, "And now it is saving your life. So hold still and be quiet." Asa, standing in the doorway with another pot of hot water in his hands, had to bite down hard on his own knuckle to keep from laughing, despite the gravity of the situation. Rowan behind him did not laugh, but the smallest flicker passed across his face. Something close to gratitude, something close to awe. She changed the bandages 3 times every day. Each time she inspected the wound for the red streaks that would mean blood poisoning. Each time she lifted the dressings carefully and bent her face close to the torn flesh and smelled it the way the medical books had instructed, because the books said that the nose would warn you of infection before the eyes ever could. She forced water down Hollis's throat every hour. She spooned broth between his lips when he was lucid enough to swallow. She kept the bedroom warm enough that he would not shiver, but not so warm that the fever would build. And she watched the small, steady rise and fall of his chest, the way a watchmaker watches the second hand of a watch he has just repaired. On the second night the fever came. Hollis burned with it. His skin was hot enough to feel through the blankets when Adelaide laid her palm against his shoulder. His green eyes rolled behind his closed lids. His hands clutched at the sheets and the blankets and once blindly at the air above the bed, as if he were reaching for someone who was not there. Adelaide sat beside him through the deepest hours of that night, replacing the cool cloths on his forehead every few minutes, watching for the subtle signs that would tell her whether the fever was breaking or building towards something worse. She did not pray. She did not speak. She simply worked with the slow, careful patience of a woman who understood that some battles are won by the simple refusal to leave the field. And in the deepest silence of 3 o'clock in the morning, when the fire had burned down to red embers in the bedroom hearth, and the wind was howling outside the cabin walls like something alive and hungry, Adelaide began to hum, softly, almost too soft to hear. An old lullaby her mother had hummed in Boston when Adelaide had been small and sick and frightened. A simple, wordless melody about nothing in particular. About the moon, about the sea, about a house with a light in the window that was always waiting for whoever needed to come home. Hollis's hand found hers in the dim red glow of the embers. His grip was weak, but it was desperate. The grip of a man clinging to something real in a world that had gone shapeless and terrifying. He whispered a single word, "Mother." Adelaide's tears came then, silent and unstoppable, sliding down her cheeks and dripping onto the quilt that Hollis's actual mother had sewn years before her death. But Adelaide's voice did not waver. She kept humming, and she squeezed Hollis's hand back gently, and she leaned close enough to his ear that he could hear her speak. "Not your mother, but I am here, and I am not going anywhere." Something in her voice reached him even through the fever. His face softened, his breathing steadied, his grip on her hand relaxed, though he did not let go entirely. And he slept then for the first time in 12 hours, a real sleep, not the thrashing half-death of the fever. Rowan stood outside the bedroom door for most of those 3 days. He came in when she needed help moving Hollis to change the sheets. He came in when she needed water boiled or fresh bandages or another lamp. But mostly he stood in the doorway, his shoulder against the frame, watching her work, watching her small, steady hands move with gentle precision as she changed the bandages, watching her soft voice turn firm and brooking no argument when she told Hollis to drink to rest, to stop trying to sit up, watching her pour herself into the care of his brother with a selflessness that left no room for pretense or performance. This was real. This was who she was. And the love that rose in Rowan Pendleton's chest during those 3 days was so powerful that it frightened him. Because he had been telling himself for weeks now that what he felt was gratitude or admiration or simple affection. But watching Adelaide save his brother's life with knowledge from books and iron from her own soul, he could no longer pretend. This was love. The kind of love that rearranges everything inside a man and leaves him standing in the wreckage of who he used to be, looking around at a new landscape he does not recognize. "She has earned every part of this life," Rowan said quietly to Asa one evening, the two of them standing on the porch in the cold blue dusk, while inside the cabin Adelaide bathed Hollis's forehead with cool water for the 100th time. Asa, who had been watching his brother carefully through 3 sleepless days, simply nodded. He did not crow about being right. He did not say, "I told you so." He simply nodded once and put his hand briefly on Rowan's shoulder and went inside to bring his brother a cup of coffee. Adelaide in the bedroom with the door cracked open the smallest fraction so that she could hear if either of the brothers called her, had heard every word. She did not let on. She simply kept working. But something in her chest, some last hard knot she had been carrying since the day she stepped off the eastbound train in Boston 3 years ago, came undone in that moment and would never be tied up quite the same way again. On the 3rd morning, the fever broke. Hollis's eyes opened, clear, green, sharp as cut glass. The first thing he saw was Adelaide, asleep in the wooden chair beside his bed, her head resting against the edge of the mattress, her hand still holding his. She looked exhausted, dark circles under her eyes, her honey blonde hair unpinned and tangled. But Hollis, in that first waking moment, thought she looked like the most tired angel he had ever seen. He did not wake her. He lay very still, looking at the ceiling, feeling her hand in his, warm and small and real. And for the first time in 5 years since the winter, his parents had died 2 weeks apart. The word alone did not apply to Hollis Pendleton. When Adelaide finally stirred and woke and saw him looking at her, she pulled her hand back flustered. He held on for a half-second longer than she expected. Then he released her. "Thank you," he said. 2 words. The man who spoke fewer words in a week than most men spoke in an hour, choosing the only 2 that mattered. Then, because the tracker in him never slept, even when the rest of him had nearly died, he added, 2 men, rifles, city boots, South Ridge. That evening, the 4 of them gathered in the kitchen. Hollis sat propped up in a chair by the stove, pale but alive, eating his first solid food in 3 days. Asa had ridden to Ridgeway and back in a single day to alert Sheriff Eli Boone, and he had returned with news that sat in the warm kitchen like a loaded gun on the table. Theodore Vance had arrived in Idaho. He was staying at the hotel in Ridgeway. He had 2 men with him matching the descriptions of the ambushers and a lawyer carrying a leather briefcase full of papers intended to establish a legal claim on Adelaide as a property of the Vance family on the grounds of a broken engagement, financial debts, and several other invented technicalities the lawyer had spent the train ride west polishing into the shape of a legal threat. Adelaide heard this and went very still. Then she spoke, and her voice was steady even though her hands were not. "I should leave. If I go, he will leave you alone. All of this, Hollis being shot, the threats, all of it is because of me." 3 voices answered her at once. 3 brothers who agreed on almost nothing except this. "You are not going anywhere." "Rowan, you stay." "Hollis," his voice was thin but absolutely certain. "I did not bring you here to let you go." "Asa." And then Rowan said what he had been holding inside for weeks. He stood up from his chair. He came around the table. He stopped in front of her, the difference in their heights making him look down at her the way a mountain looks down at the valley below it. And he spoke with a voice that trembled slightly, with the effort of saying words he had never said aloud to any living soul. "Adelaide, I prayed for companionship. I prayed for someone to share this life with. And then you appeared, exactly like an answer straight from heaven. I tried to keep my distance. I tried not to hope. I tried to protect myself from being hurt. But I cannot do it anymore." The fire crackled in the stove. The wind pressed gently against the cabin walls. The whole world seemed to be holding its breath. "I love you, Adelaide, in a way I did not think I was still capable of loving. And I will not let anyone take you from here. Not if you want to stay." Adelaide stepped forward. She placed her small hand flat against his chest, directly over his heart. She could feel it hammering underneath her palm, fast and hard. The heart of a man who was terrified, not of bears or blizzards or gunmen, of being vulnerable, of being seen. "I want to stay," she said. "I want to stay with you. I have loved you since the night you told me about your mother by the fire, since the morning I found wildflowers on my windowsill and knew you had put them there and would never admit it. I want to build this life with you, Rowan Pendleton. Please let me stay." Rowan bent down. He closed the distance between them. He pressed his lips to her forehead, gentle, reverent, full of a promise that did not need words because it was already written into every line of his body, into every day he had risen before dawn for 5 years to build this place, into every silent prayer he had sent up into the indifferent Idaho sky. "Stay," he whispered. "Forever. I did not expect you, but I am not letting you go." The next day, Rowan and Adelaide rode down to Ridgeway together. They went to the sheriff's office first. Sheriff Eli Boone was a decent man, stretched thin across too much territory and too few deputies, and he listened to their account and examined the threatening letter that Aunt Bess had brought up the mountain. He was sympathetic, but he was also honest. "I need more than a letter and a suspicion to arrest a man from Boston with a lawyer in his pocket and money behind him. Bring me evidence, witnesses, something I can take to a judge." They stepped out of the sheriff's office and onto the wooden sidewalk into the cold afternoon light. Theodore Vance was waiting on the opposite side of the street. He stood very still in front of the Ridgeway Hotel, immaculate in a black vest and a wool overcoat that would have looked perfectly correct on a Boston street and looked absurd in the dusty frontier town of Ridgeway. Tall, with black hair slicked back from a high forehead, gray eyes that held the temperature of a January creek. Beside him stood another man in a dark suit carrying a leather case, the lawyer. Theodore crossed the street with the unhurried confidence of a man who owned the ground he walked on. He stopped 10 feet from Adelaide and smiled. Not a warm smile, the kind of smile a cat gives a mouse when it knows the mouse has nowhere left to run. "Adelaide, you look different. The West suits you." His gray eyes shifted to Rowan, traveling upward because Rowan was considerably taller. Something flickered behind Theodore's composed expression. Not fear exactly, an involuntary reassessment, like a man who has just realized that the dog he was about to kick is larger than he had thought from the carriage window. And this must be the mail-order husband, or one of several from what I hear. Rowan stepped forward, placing himself between Adelaide and Theodore. He did not reach for his weapon. He did not raise his voice. He simply stood there, 6'5", broad as a barn door, his amber eyes locked onto Theodore's gray ones with the fixed intensity of a man who had already decided how this would end if he had to make it end. I know who you are, Vance, and if you are wise, you will be on the next stage out of Idaho, and you will never come back. Theodore, to his credit or to his foolishness, held his ground. Threats from a mountain rancher. I am trembling. He looked past Rowan to Adelaide. You have 1 week, Adelaide. 1 week to come back voluntarily. After that, I will use every means available to me, legal, financial, and otherwise. Rowan took one more step forward. Theodore retreated half a step before he could stop himself, an involuntary flinch in the face of pure physical authority. Then he recovered. He straightened his coat. He gave a curt nod. He walked away. The lawyer followed, glancing back once with the calculating expression of a man who was already drafting motions in his head. Adelaide watched Theodore go, and she realized something strange. Her hands were not shaking, her heart was not pounding. The man who had terrorized her in Boston, who had loomed over her life like a dark cloud for 3 years, looked small here. Small against the mountains, small next to Rowan. Small in a world where strength was measured not in money or social standing, but in what a person could build with their own 2 hands. On the ride home, Rowan stopped the wagon at a clearing that overlooked the long sweep of the valley. The sunset was doing what Idaho sunsets do, painting the whole world in shades of amber and rose and deep purple. The snow on the high peaks catching the last light of the day like distant fire. He stared straight ahead when he spoke. Not at Adelaide, because if he looked at her, he would lose his nerve. Adelaide, I want to marry you. Not because of the letter, not because of the situation, not because of Theodore Vance and his threats. Because I love you. He paused, he searched for the right words, and when they came, they were plain and unadorned and completely his. I do not have a diamond ring. I do not have a fine house in the city. I have a ranch on a mountain. 3 bedrooms, 40 head of cattle, and 2 loud brothers. But I have a promise. I will never try to make you someone you are not. I will never treat you like something to be owned. And I will spend the rest of my life trying to be worthy of you. A long silence. Mountain wind moving through the pines below, the horse stamping one hoof on the frozen dirt of the clearing. Then Rowan finally turned to look at her, and he found her smiling through tears, the widest smile he had ever seen on her face. You are the worst man in the world at proposals, she said. You just listed everything you do not have. Because I want you to know exactly what you are getting, so you will not be deceived. Rowan Pendleton. She reached up and placed her hand against his rough cheek. Yes, yes, I will marry you. With the ranch and the 40 cows and the 3 bedrooms and the 2 loud brothers. Tomorrow, if we can arrange it. He smiled then, a real smile, rare and slow and transforming like sunlight breaking through, after a week of clouds turning his stern face into something warm enough to stop her breath. He leaned down. The distance between them required him to bend considerably, and for the first time he kissed her mouth, brief, gentle, tasting of coffee and cold mountain air, the roughness of his short beard against the softness of her cheek. Then he pulled back. His amber eyes were very bright. Tomorrow, he said, I will speak to the preacher. But tomorrow brought something else entirely. Adelaide rode alone to visit Aunt Bess the following morning. The Tate Ranch was closer to Ridgeway than to the Pendleton place, and the road between them was well-traveled and considered safe. Rowan had hesitated to let her go without him, but the Tate Ranch was practically in town. Walter Tate was a capable man with a loaded rifle hanging above his front door. Adelaide would be fine. She would be safe. She never arrived. Two riders intercepted her on the trail 3 miles south of the ranch. They came out of the tree line, fast flanking her horse before she could turn, and one of them grabbed her reins while the other pulled alongside and took her arm. They were not rough. They did not strike her or threaten her with weapons. But they were firm and they were fast, and within minutes, Adelaide Whitmore was riding a horse she did not control heading east toward a cabin she had never seen, and the mountain she had come to love was shrinking behind her with every step the horses took. When Aunt Bess Tate realized Adelaide had not arrived by mid-morning, she did not wait. She saddled her own horse and she rode straight up the mountain to the Pendleton Ranch. 15 miles of hard trail. She did it in under 2 hours because Margaret Tate was a frontier woman who understood that speed was the difference between a problem and a tragedy. She found Rowan in the yard splitting wood. The axe was still raised above his head when he saw her face. "Adelaide never came," Bess said. She did not need to say anything else. The axe hit the ground. Rowan stood motionless for 3 seconds. To Hollis, watching from the cabin window with his hand pressed against the still healing wound in his side, those 3 seconds were the most frightening thing he had witnessed in a life that had included watching his own parents die of fever 2 weeks apart. Because in those 3 seconds, the light in Rowan Pendleton's amber eyes went out. Not dimmed, not flickered. Went out the way a lamp goes out when you turn the wick all the way down. And what replaced it was something Hollis recognized from the eyes of wounded animals. The blank, desperate focus of a creature that has nothing left to lose. Then Rowan moved. Hollis was already standing, gripping the bedpost for support, his wound pulling sharply with every breath, but his green eyes blazed. Asa was already checking the loads in 2 revolvers, his face set like stone, every trace of boyishness gone. "We ride," Rowan said. Hollis insisted on coming. Rowan compromised. "You lead from horseback. You do not dismount. You do not run. You point. Asa and I act." Hollis accepted. From a man who had never accepted limitations from anyone in his life, that was its own kind of sacrifice. 3 brothers rode into the cold timber. Hollis, despite the pain that whitened his knuckles on the reins, tracked the way he always tracked. Reading hoof prints in the soft snow, distinguishing Adelaide's horse lighter shod with mountain shoes from the horses of her captors, heavier, wearing the new city farrier work that they had had done in Ridgeway sometime in the past week. He followed the trail with the patience and precision that made him the best tracker in the Sawtooth Valley. And within 3 hours, he had found the cabin. It sat in a clearing 2 miles off the main trail, a prospector's shack long since abandoned. Smoke from the chimney. 2 horses tied outside, lamplight flickering through the single window. Inside that cabin, Adelaide Whitmore sat on a wooden crate across from the man who believed he owned her. Theodore Vance had brought a china teacup with him from Boston. He was drinking tea from it now. His legs crossed, his posture relaxed. The very picture of civilized calm in a room that smelled of mildew and rotting wood. It was perhaps the most revealing detail of his character. Even in the wilderness, even in a decaying cabin in the middle of nowhere, he needed to recreate the trappings of control, the familiar rituals, the fine things, the illusion that he was still in charge of his world. "Adelaide," he said. His voice was sweet in a way that made her skin crawl. "I do not want to hurt you. I never wanted that. I simply want you to come home. To come back where you belong." Adelaide's hands were bound in front of her loosely with rope that the hired men had tied with a certain reluctant carefulness that suggested they had rules about how they treated women. She looked at Theodore across the dim, smoky room, and she waited for the fear to come. The old fear, the Boston fear, the kind that had kept her silent at dinner parties while he talked over her. That had made her agree to an engagement she did not want. That had made her feel small and powerless, and worth nothing more than the decorative function she had served. The fear did not come. In its place was something new, something that had been growing inside her since the morning she woke up in Rowan Pendleton's bed with a stranger's hand holding a cup of water to her lips and a deep voice promising her that she would be all right. Something that had hardened through weeks of splitting firewood and chasing chickens and riding horses and nursing gunshot wounds and standing in the doorway of a cabin on a mountain, knowing in her bones that this was where she was supposed to be. She was not afraid of Theodore Vance anymore, and that more than anything else told her exactly how far she had come. "Do you know what makes you different from Rowan Pendleton?" she asked. Her voice was calm, remarkably calm. Theodore set his teacup on the overturned barrel that served as a table. His gray eyes narrowed. "Rowan is stronger than you, Theodore. Taller, braver, more capable in every way that matters out here. But that is not the biggest difference between you." She paused. She held his gaze. "When Rowan looks at me, he sees a person. When you look at me, you see a thing. I spent too many years being a thing that belonged to someone else. That is over now." Theodore rose from his chair, his face flushed red. Not from shame, from the outraged disbelief that a former governess, a girl with nothing, would dare to speak to him in this way. "You will regret this." "I already have regrets," Adelaide said, her voice gaining an edge that would have been unthinkable 6 weeks ago. "I regret being silent for so long. I regret letting your family treat me like property and accepting it because I thought I had no choice. But I do have a choice. I have made it. And I choose Rowan. I choose this mountain. I choose the life I am building with my own 2 hands, not the one you want to shove me into." Theodore stepped toward her. His composure was cracking. The polished Boston veneer was splitting apart to reveal something ugly underneath. Something that had always been there but had been hidden behind the manners and the money and the careful smile. And that was when the cabin door exploded inward. Rowan Pendleton filled the doorframe the way a storm fills a valley. His shoulders nearly touched both sides of the frame, sweat and snow on his face, his breath coming in white clouds in the cold air. His father's shotgun cradled in arms thick as pine boughs, and on his face was a calm so absolute and so controlled that it was more terrifying than any rage could ever be. This was not a man who had lost his temper. This was a man in perfect command of himself, and that command was directed entirely at Theodore Vance. Theodore lurched backward. His hand reached for the pistol on the table. The 2 hired guns stationed outside had already made their calculation. 3 enormous men armed and furious and positioned with tactical precision. One at the back door, one on the ridge with a rifle, and this one, the mountain of a man standing in the front entrance with a shotgun and eyes like molten gold. The hired men set their weapons on the ground and raised their hands. "We were paid to find the girl," one of them said quickly, "not to die for her." Rowan crossed the room in 2 strides and took the pistol from Theodore's hand the way a parent takes a dangerous toy from a child. Without effort, without hurry. The difference in their physical strength was so vast that it did not even qualify as a contest. "You sent men to shoot my brother," Rowan said. Each word landed like a hammer on an anvil. "You kidnapped the woman I love." Theodore pressed himself against the cabin wall. He looked up into amber eyes that held no mercy and no uncertainty, and for the first time in his privileged and pampered life, he understood what it meant to be powerless. Truly powerless. Not the inconvenience of a business setback, not the embarrassment of a social misstep. The bone-deep, body-freezing powerlessness of standing in front of a man who could end you with his bare hands and knowing that the only reason he had not done so already was a choice he was making second by second to hold himself back. Adelaide stood. She placed her bound hands against Rowan's arm, a small touch on a large arm, but the weight of it was greater than any physical force. "Do not," she said softly, "do not become what he wants you to be. Let the law handle this." Rowan looked at Adelaide. In her eyes he saw not fear but faith. Faith that he was more than his anger, more than his strength, that he was the man she had chosen, not because he could break things, but because he could choose not to. And that faith, small and fierce and unshakable, pulled him back from the edge. "I am letting you go." Rowan said to Theodore. Because she asked me to. But if I see your face in Idaho again, God himself will not be able to help you. He released Theodore, who slid down the wall to the cabin floor, coughing and gasping. Asa appeared at the back door with Sheriff Eli Boone, who had been alerted by Aunt Bess and was already on his way up the mountain. Theodore Vance was placed under arrest for kidnapping and conspiracy to commit assault. And then Rowan turned to Adelaide. He wrapped his arms around her and held her against his chest. Held her the way a man holds something he almost lost. Held her with a desperate trembling strength that belied every stoic mask he had ever worn. His face pressed into her hair, and he whispered the same words over and over so quietly that only she could hear them. You are here. You are here. You are here. Hollis, watching from the hillside through the scope of his rifle, lowered the weapon and allowed himself to breathe for the first time in hours. Asa, standing beside the sheriff, wiped his eyes with the back of his hand and pretended it was the wind. I am not going anywhere. Adelaide said, her face pressed against his chest, listening to the heartbeat that had become the most important sound in her world. I am home. You are home, Rowan said, and his voice broke on the word home. Broke wide open, and everything he had held inside for 5 years of solitude and grief and stubborn self-reliance came pouring through the crack. The wedding took place on a cold but clear day at the end of December 1878 in the small white church in Ridgeway. Aunt Bess and Walter Tate stood as witnesses. Hollis stood beside Rowan at the altar, his face showing an emotion so rare that the handful of townspeople in attendance did not quite know what to make of it. He was smiling, not the faint, barely there flicker that passed for a smile in Hollis's daily life. A real smile, full and unguarded, the kind that reaches the eyes and stays there. Asa held the wedding ring, a simple gold band that the three brothers had pooled their money to buy from the jeweler in Ridgeway. Asa cried through the entire ceremony. The man who laughed more than anyone in Idaho territory could not stop the tears from rolling down his face as he watched his oldest brother stand before God and make promises to the woman that his secret letter had brought across an entire continent. Adelaide wore a white dress that Aunt Bess had helped her sew. Simple, practical, beautiful in the way that honest things are beautiful, without ornament or pretension. Her honey blonde hair was pinned up with a sprig of dried wildflower that Asa had pressed between the pages of a book weeks ago, saving it for this day without telling anyone. When Rowan slid the gold band onto Adelaide's finger and kissed her as his wife, something fundamental shifted inside him. A piece he had not known was missing clicked into place. 5 years of carrying everything alone. 5 years of silence and work and endurance. And now finally someone to share it all with. The wedding breakfast was held at the Tate Ranch. Neighbors came. Ranch families who had ridden 2 hours just to be there. Old Henderson, the rancher, who would later lose $20 to Adelaide's negotiating skills, brought a jug of apple brandy and a handshake that nearly broke Rowan's fingers. And then Asa brought out the violin. It had been their father's, a battered instrument with a crack along the neck that their father had repaired with glue and a strip of rawhide. It had not been played since the night before he died. Asa drew the bow across the strings, and the first notes of a Scottish folk song filled the room. A melody their father had sung to their mother on winter evenings when the world outside was frozen and the world inside was warm. Rowan looked at Adelaide. Adelaide looked at Rowan, and they danced. Badly. Rowan had never danced in his life. His attempt involved a great deal of counting under his breath and stepping on toes and holding Adelaide as though she were something that might shatter if he gripped too hard. But he tried. That was when Hollis laughed. It came from the corner of the room where he was sitting with a cup of cider watching the spectacle of his enormous brother attempting to waltz. It was not a chuckle or a snort. It was a laugh. A full, deep, unrestrained sound that rose from somewhere inside Hollis Pendleton that had been sealed shut for 5 years. The sound of it stopped the room. Asa's bow froze on the strings. Rowan and Adelaide stopped mid-step. Every head turned toward the quietest man in Idaho, who was laughing as though he had just remembered how. No one spoke. No one needed to. They all understood what that sound meant. The years passed in the rhythm of seasons. Rowan carried Adelaide over the threshold of the cabin that was now theirs. Their cabin, their home, their life. He set her down gently in the front room. She looked around at the simple space, the stone fireplace he had built, the quilt his mother had sewn, the photograph of his parents that she had framed and hung, the windowsill where wildflowers had appeared every morning like clockwork. "I am home," she said. "Finally, completely home." Theodore Vance was convicted in the spring trial of kidnapping and conspiracy to assault. The two hired gunmen turned on their employer with the pragmatic efficiency of men who understood that loyalty to a Boston businessman was not worth a prison sentence in Idaho. Hollis testified by standing before the jury, lifting his shirt to show the scar on his ribs and speaking exactly 4 sentences. The jury deliberated for 40 minutes. When Theodore was led away in chains, he looked back at Adelaide one last time. And Adelaide, standing beside Rowan with her hand in his, looked back without hatred and without fear. Only sadness. Sadness for a man who had been given every advantage the world could offer and had never learned the one thing that mattered: how to love someone without trying to own them. "I hope he finds peace," Adelaide said on the ride home. "I truly do." Their first child, a boy, was born in the autumn of 1879. Almost exactly 1 year after Rowan had fired his revolver at the sky. They named him Ezra after Rowan's father's middle name. "I prayed for companionship." Rowan said that night, sitting on the edge of the bed with his infant son asleep in the crook of one massive arm and his wife leaning against his shoulder. "God gave me a family." Lillian arrived in 1883, blue-eyed and blonde. Her mother's image with a love of books that declared itself before she could properly walk. In 1885, Asa married May Sutter, the red-haired daughter of the Ridgeway blacksmith, a woman whose laughter could be heard from 100 yards away and whose energy matched Asa's own the way a spark matches kindling. He cried through the entire ceremony just as he had at his brother's wedding. May moved onto the mountain. Asa built a house beside the main cabin, and for the first time there were 2 lit windows on the sawtooth slope at night instead of one. And the isolation that had once pressed down on Rowan like a physical weight lifted by half. Nathaniel was born in 1888, joyful, mischievous, carrying Asa's energy in a smaller package. The drought came in the summer of 1886. No rain for 3 months. The creek slowed to trickles. The meadow grass turned yellow and brittle as paper. The cattle grew thin, and Rowan, faced with the possibility of losing everything he had built, did what he had always done before Adelaide arrived. He shut down. He closed up. He tried to carry it all alone. She confronted him after the children were asleep, standing in the kitchen, her voice carrying not anger but pain. "You are pushing me out. You are turning back into the man who fired his gun at the sky alone. But you are not alone anymore, Rowan. You have me. Let me help." He slept on the porch that night. But when he lay down on the hard boards, he found that Adelaide had already placed a blanket and a pillow there, because she knew him. She knew exactly what he would do, and she had prepared for it. In the morning, he came inside. "I am sorry," Rowan said, "for thinking I had to carry everything alone, for forgetting that I promised to share this life with you." Adelaide crossed the room and placed her hand on his chest, directly over his heart, in the same spot where she had placed it the night he told her he loved her. "The mountain does not care," she said, "but I do." They made a plan together. They sold part of the herd before prices dropped further. They diversified with chickens and pigs. The plan worked, the drought broke, and the lesson stayed with them for the rest of their lives. Never fight alone when there is someone who wants to fight beside you. Hollis discovered wood carving in 1887, starting with simple toys for the children. The art became his meditation, his healing. Deer and bears and horses and eagles emerged from raw blocks of pine as though they had been waiting inside all along. He never married. Adelaide asked him once gently whether he ever wanted to find someone. Hollis thought for a long time before answering, the way he always thought, carefully and thoroughly. I have a family, he said. I have the mountain. I have wood to carve. Some men need less than that. I am one of them. 40 years passed in this rhythm. Children grew. Grandchildren came. May died of pneumonia in the winter of 1912, and Asa lost his smile for the first time in his life. Rowan sat beside him on the porch and said nothing. He simply sat there, shoulder to shoulder with his youngest brother, letting his presence say what words could not. Winter always ends, Adelaide told Asa softly one evening when she brought him supper he had not asked for. And Asa looked up at her and recognized the words Rowan had spoken on a wagon ride home from Ridgeway 34 years before. October 1918. 40 years on the porch. Rowan was nearing 70. Adelaide was in her early 60s. Their hair was silver. Their faces were lined with the map of every year they had lived on this mountain. But their hands found each other with the ease of long practice, the way they had found each other every evening for 4 decades, without looking, without reaching, as naturally as breathing. 40 years since I collapsed on a dirt road in Idaho, Adelaide said. Since I fired my revolver at the sky and God sent me a Boston girl who barely reached my chest and had a will made of iron. Around them, the ranch hummed with life. 7 grandchildren playing in the yard. From the house next door, the sound of a violin. Not Asa playing anymore. His fingers were stiff with age, but Ezra's oldest child learning the Scottish melody that had become a Pendleton tradition. Hollis sat in his corner of the porch, 65 years old, white-haired but green-eyed, still carving an eagle for the newest great-grandchild. You know what I am most grateful for, Rowan said. Not the ranch, not the children. It is that I got to share all of it with you, that I never had to face any of it alone again. You gave me that, Adelaide. From the morning you opened your eyes in my bed and looked up at me and asked if my kindness had a price. Adelaide passed away in her sleep on a spring morning in 1932, 76 years old. Her hand was in Rowan's hand where it had been every night for 53 years. Their 3 children stood around the bed. Hollis stood by the window, one hand resting on the framed photograph of Rowan's parents that Adelaide had hung on the wall decades ago. The day after the funeral, Rowan sat alone on the porch. For the first time in 53 years, the chair beside him was empty. Hollis, 79 years old, came out and sat next to him without a word. She would scold me if I sat here feeling sorry for myself, Rowan said. She would scold you and make you drink coffee, Hollis replied. Rowan laughed, a real laugh, because that was exactly what Adelaide would have done. Hollis died 4 months before Rowan, quietly, in his afternoon nap on the porch, his carving knife still in his hand, a wooden rabbit half finished for the newest great-grandchild. Rowan, when he heard, said only this. He went the way he lived, silent and at home. Rowan Pendleton died in October 1935. 57 years to the month since the night he had fired his revolver at the sky and prayed for someone to share his life. He died on the porch watching the Idaho sunset, the same sunset he had shared with Adelaide 10,000 times. His last thought was of her smile. Asa, the last of the brothers, held Rowan's hand at the end. Do you remember the letter I wrote? Asa said softly. I wrote, if that is good enough for you, then you are good enough for us. I did not know then that I was writing the truest thing I would ever write. Rowan squeezed his brother's hand gently, once, and then let go. Asa lived to be 88, passing in 1944, and until his final breath, he told the story of his oldest brother, and the prayer, and the girl from Boston, and the wildflowers on the windowsill, and the night in the cabin when Hollis laughed. They are buried side by side on the hill overlooking the ranch they built together. Rowan and Adelaide in the center, Hollis on the right, Asa on the left, May behind Asa where she belongs. The headstone is simple, just names and dates and 2 words that say everything. Answered prayers. The ranch still stands. The Pendleton name still marks the gate. And on quiet October evenings, when the light slants gold across the Idaho landscape and the air holds a particular quality of autumn, people swear they can still see them. Two figures on the old porch. Three, actually, because Hollis is always there in his corner, carving wood in the silence. Hands intertwined, watching the sunset together. Still in love after all those years. Still grateful for the desperate prayer that started it all. For the letter a younger brother wrote in secret, and for the small, fierce, extraordinary woman who walked 4,000 miles to become the home that a lonely man on a mountain needed more than he ever knew. This is where she belonged. Always. And if you listen closely on those still evenings when the wind dies down and the stars begin to emerge over the sawtooth peaks, you can almost hear it. A deep voice, rough with age and softened by decades of love, saying the words that became the heartbeat of an entire family. Coffee is ready.